40% of China's artificial intelligence chip market belonged to Nvidia by revenue through official channels in 2022. 8% is where the most recent analyst forecasts placed that share under sustained enforcement of the export controls that followed. The gap between those two readings is 32 percentage points, and it moved in roughly 2 years. This script traces what produced that delta, what absorbed it, and why the instrument recording the 8% has a blind spot large enough to change the conclusion. The 40% reading is the baseline. It reflects the period before October 2022, when Nvidia's accelerators moved through licensed export channels into Chinese cloud providers, research institutions, and technology companies without restriction. Demand for compute-intensive workloads was growing sharply across that period, and Nvidia held a commanding position not only in hardware but in the software environment that hardware ran. The frameworks Chinese developers depended on were built around CUDA, Nvidia's proprietary compute platform. The deep learning libraries, the model repositories, the training pipelines, the bulk of the stack assumed Nvidia silicon underneath. 40% of the chip market by revenue, with software depth that the revenue share alone understated. That was the first reading. October 2022 is the date of the first control. The United States government restricted export of the A100 and the H100 to China without a license. Those two parts were the primary hardware Nvidia sold into Chinese artificial intelligence workloads. The H100 in particular was the leading training accelerator globally at the time. The immediate response from Nvidia was a workaround, the A800 and the H800, variants with artificially reduced interconnect bandwidth, designed to fall below the technical thresholds the controls specified. That product line bought roughly a year. In October 2023, the controls were tightened to close the gap, and the A800 and H800 were added to the restricted list. Each legislative turn removed another product from the official channel in a discrete step. The share did not erode gradually, it compressed in jumps each time a workaround was foreclosed. The forecast reading of 8% reflects what remains of Nvidia's official channel share once both rounds of controls are fully enforced. 8%. The delta from the baseline is 32 points. 2 readings, 32 points. That is the headline number, and it is not in dispute. What filled the space those 32 points vacated is the counter reading. Huawei's Ascend line of artificial intelligence accelerators entered the domestic market from a position that was, in 2021, negligible in the accelerator segment. Analyst projections published across 2024 and into 2025 place Huawei near 50% of domestic artificial intelligence chip procurement by volume. The company claims this projection, and procurement disclosures from Baidu, ByteDance, and several state-linked cloud providers have confirmed Ascend orders as H100 access closed. Demand in the Chinese artificial intelligence sector did not contract when the controls landed. It migrated. The 32-point drop on Nvidia's line is mirrored with a lag on Huawei's line. The control produced the domestic supplier it was designed to prevent. That migration is the first interpretation of the delta. A share drop of 32 points inside 2 years is not a market that paused or decelerated. It is a market that was forcibly steered. Chinese cloud providers and laboratories needed accelerators regardless of where they were manufactured. When the official channel for Nvidia hardware was progressively closed, procurement teams did not reduce compute spend. They reoriented it. The restriction did not shrink Chinese artificial intelligence infrastructure investment. It redirected the invoice. The Ascend 910B is the specific part that absorbed the bulk of that redirect. It is manufactured at SMIC, China's leading domestic foundry, on what is described as an N+2 process node, a non-EUV lithography process that industry analysts at SemiAnalysis and Bernstein estimate to be roughly equivalent in density to a 7-nanometer class node. Nvidia's H100 was manufactured at TSMC on a 4-nanometer class process. That gap, 2 to 3 process generations by density and power efficiency, is not a rounding error. It translates directly into chip area required to deliver equivalent compute, memory bandwidth ceiling, and thermal output per watt at scale. The Ascend 910B achieved reported performance numbers comparable to previous generation Nvidia parts, which is a meaningful engineering result for a chip built on a constrained process. But the process constraint is structural. EUV lithography equipment from ASML remains under export controls sustained by the Netherlands government, and without EUV, SMIC cannot shrink below its current node. Huawei's share gain is real. Its performance per watt at scale is bounded by the node it can access, and that node is not moving toward the leading edge under current export conditions. That boundary is the physical ceiling on the counter reading. The 50% procurement share figure is plausible given the disclosed orders. It is not confirmed by independently audited shipment and activation data. Huawei does not publish chip sales by segment. An order placed is not a chip delivered. A chip delivered is not a chip running at rated throughput. Yield rates on the Ascend 910B have not been published. High volume output from SMIC's N+2 process at the scale, implied by a 50% market position, requires sustained manufacturing performance that has not been independently verified. The 50% figure is the most cited analyst central estimate. It is not a floor. It is a projection extrapolated from disclosed procurement and partner orders, and it carries the uncertainty that comes with any extrapolation from incomplete data. The share instrument has a second problem, and it sits on Nvidia's side of the ledger. The 8% figure is a reading from the visible pipe, licensed export, declared customs, traceable invoice. A documented flow of H100 and A100 class accelerators has moved through third-country intermediaries into Chinese data centers at volumes the public figure cannot capture. The United States Commerce Department has issued enforcement actions and provided guidance to cloud providers specifically because transshipment through Singapore, Malaysia, and intermediaries in the Middle East was confirmed to be occurring at commercially meaningful scale. The mechanism is straightforward. Chips are exported legally from the United States to a third country, then re-exported without a United States license to a final destination in China. The original export appears compliant in the trade record. The re-export is the violation. Because the final destination is not recorded in United States trade data, the volume does not enter the denominator used to compute Nvidia's official share. The 8% is computed from a fraction whose numerator is restricted but whose denominator includes a term the gauge cannot see. A flow meter installed on the main pipe gives an accurate reading of what moves through that pipe. It cannot read the parallel line dug around the meter. The 8% is the main pipe reading. The parallel line is documented. Enforcement actions confirm it exists and that it operated at commercially meaningful volume, but its diameter is unknown. The total flow through both pipes is the number that would describe Nvidia's real presence in Chinese artificial intelligence infrastructure. The instrument reports one pipe. The story requires both. That correction term is the second interpretation of the delta. The 8% overstates the collapse in Nvidia's real presence in the Chinese market precisely because it excludes the gray market inflow that enforcement actions confirm was occurring. How much it overstates is the open question. The correction could be a few percentage points, meaningful but not decisive. It could be large enough that the true Nvidia presence in Chinese artificial intelligence infrastructure is several multiples of the official reading. The instrument's blind spot has a documented shape and no measured size. The third interpretation involves the gap between procurement share and compute share. Procurement figures count units ordered and delivered. Workload figures count hours of compute actually run. Those two numbers can diverge substantially, and in the current environment there is specific reason to expect divergence. Chinese artificial intelligence laboratories that have procured Ascend hardware have also, in a number of documented cases, maintained CUDA dependency for models and pipelines that have not been migrated. Huawei's compute software platform for neural networks is actively developed, but it lags in third-party model support compared to the ecosystem built around Nvidia's platform over more than a decade. A lab that procured Ascend units but kept CUDA-dependent training runs executing on gray market Nvidia hardware would appear in both tallies simultaneously. As an Ascend customer in the procurement data and as a CUDA customer in the compute hour data. The headline share figure measures boxes shipped. It does not measure compute hours consumed. The two readings are not the same measurement and the gap between them is currently unquantified. Here is where the margin of error sits on the conclusion. The first uncertainty is on the Huawei side. The 50% procurement projection rests on disclosed orders and partner announcements, not on independently audited activation data. The gap between a procurement figure and a running throughput figure could be narrow or substantial, and no public data set distinguishes them. The second uncertainty is the gray market correction to the 8%. Directionally confirmed by enforcement actions, unquantified in magnitude, and potentially large enough to make the actual Nvidia presence in Chinese artificial intelligence infrastructure several times the official share reading. Those two uncertainties move in opposite directions relative to the dominant narrative. Overstating Huawei's effective capacity and overstating Nvidia's official share collapse are corrections that partially offset each other in the final picture, but they do not cancel. The third constraint is physical. A share gain built on a process node, 2 generations behind the leading edge is durable only if the workloads it serves do not require leading-edge performance. Frontier model training stresses power envelope and memory bandwidth in ways that N+2 silicon handles measurably less efficiently than a 4-nanometer class node. If Chinese laboratories continue scaling frontier models, the process gap becomes a performance ceiling that procurement share figures do not reflect. The share number can keep rising while the capability gap simultaneously widens. Those 3 corrections do not invalidate the delta. They size the uncertainty around it. The 40-8 move is real and directionally correct. The mechanism is documented. The magnitude of the offset terms is what the instrument cannot currently read. 2 readings. 1 instrument. The share figure dropped 32 points in roughly 2 years, and the entity that absorbed those points is the domestic supplier the controls were designed to forestall. That is the central delta. What remains open is how much of the 8% is a genuine floor and how much of it is an artifact of a gauge that reads only the official channel. The restriction did not compress the market. It compressed the visible market. The invisible portion, the gray market inflow whose volume enforcement actions confirm but do not quantify, and the compute hour gap between procurement figures and actual workload execution, is now the variable that determines whether this reads as a decisive outcome for export controls or as the most expensive customer acquisition campaign Huawei never had to pay for. The number in is 8%. The number out, once you account for what the gauge cannot read, is still being written. The next reading that will matter is Huawei's Ascend 910C volume ramp and whether SMIC's yield on the N+2 node supports the procurement projections by the end of 2025. If yield data surfaces through supply chain disclosures, through power consumption reports at Chinese data centers, or through a subsequent enforcement action that sizes the gray market flow, the correction term gets a magnitude. That is when the instrument will report a number worth comparing to the 32-point delta. If you want to track that reading when it moves, subscribe and turn on notifications. That is when this channel reports again.